What is up, gang? Today is day 22 of PR30, press record 30. And today we're going to be talking about continuation of yesterday's episode. This is going to be a Leaf by Niggle part 2. And in today's episode, I'm going to give you an overview of the plot and walk you through the story so you can reflect a little bit more on yesterday's themes. It may be helpful after you watch this episode to go back and watch yesterday's. In hindsight, I may have recorded them out of order, but I'm not sure that there is a great order. Like the story itself, it's one that you come back to time and time again. So I'm hopeful that when you need a little reflection and meditation, these two episodes together as companions are useful enough that they are worthy of watching and rewatching. So today, what I want to do, and apologies, I'm a little sweaty, just got done with a run, and shooting this video before I shower and go into work. Give myself a little bit of time to cool down. And also, just as my mind is fresh, I wanted to do this video. Two things actually that came up on my run that I think are important lessons. This is somewhat unrelated to Leaf by Niggle. In the process of writing my second book, there are a number of patterns that show themselves in stories and myths that make you go, make you think about when you see them in life, and how, if myths are mirrors, how we might symbolically sort of align ourselves with the hero by what seemingly small actions or things we do or approaches we take in life. Two things that came up on my run today are one, never stop just before a bridge, and two, always stop at a church. So in myth, bridge or river always marks a transition from one world to the next, from one stage to the next, from one version of oneself to a higher, better, more refined version of oneself. That transition is always marked by a boundary or a river or a bridge. And this is why there are trolls under the bridge or other monsters that are met at the bridge, because they are something like a threshold guardian that you must push past to go from your old world into a new world. So that's lesson one, never stop at a bridge. Two, always stop at a church. This predominantly comes as a lesson from King Arthur and the King Arthur legends. And why I say always stop at a church, because there's something about stopping at a church in story which puts the hero, the adventurer, in touch with the transcendent. It always serves as something like a sanctuary, or as a place where the person establishes a relationship with their calling and their mission. So a church is an oasis. It's a sanctuary. It's a thing that causes you to be in relationship and companionship and anchor yourself, steep yourself, bathe yourself in your mission. So those are the two things from our run that I briefly just wanted to touch on to recap. It's one, never stop at a bridge. Two, always stop at a church. Now, Leaf by Niggle. So it starts, there once was a little man called Niggle who had a long journey to make. Now, if we remember that this is written by Tolkien, we might recognize, if we've read The Hobbit, something like the opening line of The Hobbit, which reads, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit." That introduces the Hobbit story. With this line, there once was a little man called Niggle who had a long journey to make. We're introduced to Niggle in Leaf by Niggle. Now, the first two things that we learn about Niggle are, one, he's a painter, and two, he has a long journey to make. Now, that long journey, as we talked about yesterday, is representative of one that we all must make, which is death. And it's Niggle's highest obsession in his life to paint this one image. It's called the tree. So this is what we find out about the tree. It had begun with a leaf caught in the wind and became a tree. And the tree grew, sending out innumerable branches and thrusting out the most fantastic roots. Strange birds came and settled on the twigs and had to be attended to. Then all around the tree and behind it, through the gaps, it and the leaves and boughs, a country began to open out, and there was a glimpse of a forest marching out over the land, and of mountains tipped with snow. Niggle lost interest in all his other pictures, or else he took them and tacked them to the edges of his great picture. Soon the canvas became so large that he had to get a ladder, and he ran up and down it, putting in a touch here and rubbing out a patch there. So what we learn in this part of the story, it's a little ambiguous as to whether Niggle is actually painting this thing, or whether this is a vision, an image that he holds in his head. Now, what we find out about Niggle after this is he has a way of putting off painting, focusing on just leaves or singular leaves rather than finishing the whole thing, which leads us to the belief that this great tree exists only in Niggle's imagination as an idea and an ideal that he wants to work toward, but he can never make very much progress toward. So this is the tension that's set up in the beginning of the book. He has this grand vision of thing he wants to paint. He wants to dedicate his life to, but he has a journey coming. That's the first obstacle, a journey that he has to make that will take him from a project. That's his first obstacle. His second obstacle is that he's always getting interrupted either by his neighbor Parrish or the daily duties and distractions that he has to deal with. It's the second obstacle. His third obstacle is himself. He is always getting distracted. Even what little time he does have to dedicate to his painting, he finds himself focused on leaves and perfectionism and small, minute details. So this is all set up in the beginning of the story. Now, the plot really begins to twist when Parrish, who is his only real neighbor, knocks at his door and asks Niggle for two things. One, for material to repair his roof. Turns out that wind blew off half his roof and made his wife sick and ill. Second thing that Parrish asks Niggle for is to bike to town and fetch a doctor. Niggle agrees to do the second one, bike to town and fetch a doctor, but is too attached to his painting and his picture to spare any canvas. Nevertheless, Niggle goes to town on his bike. When he goes to town on his bike, leaves a note for the doctor, and by the time he gets back home, he himself has caught a cold and becomes bedridden. This is yet another week that he is away from his painting. By the time that he starts to feel better, he goes and goes back into his station and begins to get at it again. He climbed the ladder and began to paint. Just as he began to get into it again, there was a knock at the door. It was a very tall man, a stranger, somebody known as the inspector of houses. And he comes and he tells Niggle, turns out that Niggle lives in a sort of dystopic society where he has an obligation and it's mandated by law that he help his neighbor Parrish with any materials that he has. So the inspector of houses comes and says, your neighbor's house is in disrepair, you should have repaired it, and I've now come to claim your canvas for that purpose. So he comes to take Niggle's property. But before Niggle can object, a second stranger comes in the door known as the driver. Here's the interaction. Driver, he chattered. Niggle chattered. Driver of what? You and your carriage, said the man. The carriage was ordered long ago. It came at last. It's waiting. You start on your journey today. There now, said the inspector, who was still in the room. You'll have to go, but it's a bad way to start your journey, leaving things undone. Still, we can at least make use of this canvas now. So Niggle is shuttled away by the driver and taken on a journey, put on a train. We're told the train ran almost at once into a dark tunnel. When Niggle awakes, he's in a strange platform, a place that's dim and dark, and he doesn't know where he is, but he's met by a porter who takes him to something called the Workhouse Infirmary, which most people think is something like Tolkien's version of purgatory. There, we're told he had to work hard at stated hours at digging, carpentry, and painting boards of all one plain color. He was never allowed outside. They kept him in the dark for hours to do thinking. He lost count of time. He did not even begin to feel better, nor could he be judged but whether he felt pleasure in doing anything. At first, during the first century or so, he used to worry about the past. But what we're told, at any rate, what we're told about Niggle in this sort of purgatory period, he began to learn the art of diligence, persistence, focus, concentration. He could take up a task at the moment one bell rang and lay it aside promptly in the moment the next one went, all tidy and ready to be continued at the right time. He got through quite a lot in a day now. He finished small things off neatly. He had no time of his own, and yet he was becoming a master of his time. He began to know just what he could do with it. Then suddenly they changed all his hours. Hardly let him go to bed at all. So he continues on this. We don't know if it's hours or days or centuries or years or hundreds of years or thousands of years. We don't know the exact time period. All we know is that one day, Niggle learns these virtues, and he's lying in dark, resting completely, and then he hears two disembodied voices. It seemed to be something like a court of inquiry examining Niggle's life. And what did they say about him? The first voice, who's stern but just, says, "What was the matter with him? He did not function properly. His head was not screwed on right. He wasted the time he had. He never got ready for his journey." There's a second voice who's merciful and gives grace and says, "Yes, but he's just a little man. He never meant to do anything much, and he was never very strong. But still, he managed to help others." And then the first voice says, "Yes, but when he helped others, he called them interruptions." Second voice intercedes again, advocating on behalf of Niggle, and he says, "Yes, but there is the parish case, the one that came in later. He was Niggle's neighbor, never did a stroke for him, and seldom showed any gratitude at all. But there is no note in the records that Niggle expected parish's gratitude." There is this last report of that wet bicycle ride. I rather lay stress on that. It seems plain that this was a genuine sacrifice. Niggle guessed he was throwing away his last chance with the picture, and he guessed too that Parrish was worrying unnecessarily. "I think you put it too strongly," the first voice says. "What do you propose?" And then the second voice wins out with this sentence, which Niggle hears. I think that it is a case for a little gentle treatment now." What happens after that is Niggle wakes up in a room full of sunshine, no longer stuck in the dark, goes back to the porter, and this time is taken to a field. And in the field, it comes to a gate with a field behind it. And at that gate is a bicycle he had in life. He takes the bicycle and he rides it downhill in the sunshine until he comes to a mighty tree. Before him stood the tree, his tree finished. If you could say that of a tree that was alive, its leaves opening, its branch growing and bending in wind, so that Niggle had often felt or guessed, and had often so failed to catch. He gazed at the tree. So what Niggle comes to in this second stage is his tree, his painting finished, his vision in his head of beauty realized. But he knows, even though it's full and needs no altering, it still needs continuing. But in order to continue it, he needs Parrish. So he calls out for Parrish, and Parrish comes. He arrives, and together the two begin continuing on the work of completing this thing together. Now what we find out is that Niggle, who was messy and unfocused in life, is now able to diligently attend to tasks. What we find about Parrish, who was unmoved by the aesthetically pleasing or the beauty of the world in life, is now soaking it in full. And so we get the sense that in this infirmary, in this purgatory, what these two struggled with in life, they learn in this afterlife, in this death. And then they come to this Niggle's tree and they begin working together until the day comes when they're finished and it's time to go. A shepherd comes down from the mountains beyond, takes and asks, "Would you like to go on?" Niggle says yes. Parrish says no because he wants to wait for his wife. And then the rest of the journey, we are told nothing. But what we are told is that Niggle was going to learn about sheep in the high pasturages and look at a wider sky and walk ever further and further towards the mountains, always uphill. Here ends the story of Niggle, but the story itself ends with two cutscenes. One cutscene is back on Earth, and we're sent into the town that was closest to where Niggle lived. We see a conversation of men in the town, which is reminiscent of the conversations in the Christmas Carol when the folks in the village talk about Scrooge. The consensus of the men in town is that Niggle's life was useless, unproductive, and meaningless because he was a painter and did nothing of value. This is contrasted with the second cutscene, which goes back to the two embodied voices. And this is the last couple of paragraphs, so I'll read them in their entirety. And this is how we'll end today's video. "It is proving very useful indeed," said the second voice. Here they're describing Niggle's parish, which Niggle and Parrish worked on together in that great field before Niggle went to the mountains. as a holiday and a refreshment. It is splendid for convalescence. And not only that, for many is the best introduction to the mountains. It works wonders in some cases. I'm sending more and more there. They seldom have to come back. No, that is so, said the first voice. I think that we should give it the new region a name. What do you propose? The porter settled that name a long time ago, said the second voice. Trained for Niggle's parish in the bay. He has shouted that for a long while now. Niggle's parish. I sent a message to both of them to tell them. What did they say? They both laughed. The mountains rang with it. That's how it ends. But what we find is something like Tolkien's thesis of subcreation when he says it is the best introduction to the mountains. That is the highest aim of all art, to be a mirror and reflection of eternity, to be beauty, to be what Roger Scruton said as a window on the ill-lit staircase of life. That's enough for today's video. I hope you enjoyed. Until next time, peace.